Welcome back to the Pursuit Podcast. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the nitty-gritty of negotiation, looking at how to negotiate the best you can get from your new job or from your promotion. Before we get started, just a quick thank you to Neximo, who sponsors this podcast. They provide APIs for SMS, voice, verification. They do a lot of really fun tools. You can find out more about them at neximo.com, or you can say thank you, if you felt inclined, at @NeximoDev on Twitter. I'm your host, Jessica Rose.
I'm here today with
Gloria Kimbwala. I'm a former campus specialist for Square, and now I am a stay-at-home mom studying blockchain technology on the Ethereum network.
Oh no, we're going to have you back to talk about blockchain.
I would love to.
And we're really lucky to be also joined by
Amy Codes. So I'm a systems software engineer currently working at Heptio. And in my free time, I make YouTube videos about software engineering at Amy Codes.
Oh, fantastic. And we've got a really advice-led session. I was really interested in having you both on to talk about what you need to know before you get ahead. Sort of advice for offer letters and career advancement and all those things maybe technologists should know about, but often we're a little bit left out. Yeah, what do you think is the most important thing to start with, maybe if you're looking for a new job before that offer letter?
I kind of want to provide context to this conversation in that on Twitter, I was tweeting out about advice for getting ahead in your career and like the logistical aspects of this. So I had a wonderful conversation with Gloria, and she had a lot of great advice in discussing like very useful advice for negotiating offer letters and like some technical terms that you should look out for on your offer letter as well.
So this is really fantastic. We're kind of getting to hopefully recreate some of that conversation in real time. But if somebody wanted to sneak over and look at your Twitter, where would they find you?
My Twitter handle is @theamycode.
And mine is G Kimbwala. It's GKIMBWALA.
Fantastic. So if folks wanted to get a little bit more in depth into the conversation, they could sort of dig through the internet history of how this came to be.
Correct. And if they ever have questions, they can always tweet at me. I'm more than happy to answer their questions too.
You hear that, dear listener? You can bother them very, very nicely. Only nicely, though. So walk me through a little bit of some of this advice. What was the thing where you were like, you know what, I think if someone only takes this one piece of advice away, I'd want them to keep that?
I would say that the most important piece of advice a software engineer could have in regards to advancement in all levels would be to have a record of their contributions. Like as you have successes, keep just a doc that says, I shipped this feature, I started this club, something that is your record of what you've done throughout the year, so that when it's time to negotiate either the offer for your new company or your promotion, you have something tangible that shows your contributions to the organization, either your previous organization or the organization that you're currently at.
And if you're working with a really great manager who's having you set goals and track things, you've already got that. Like as you tick off, get this done, ship this, you're able to sort of roll that into this doc you're describing.
Correct. And if you do have a good manager, they will also advocate for you and look at the list and say, hey, you forgot, you started, this club, that really helped, or you were on call for 25% of the time rather than the standard 10% of the time. So there's something that your manager will be able to look at it and actually kind of tweak it a little bit more if you have one that's advocating for you.
And Amy, it sounded like you had something to add.
Yeah, something I wanted that I'm actually recently looking into at work is understanding, like along that line where it's, so every week I do actually take notes of what I did that week, and then a summary, a weekly summary, a monthly summary, and also a project summary. And I keep that in a notebook on the side of my desk. But along with that, what I wanted to say is something that's really important is to look internally in terms of what your company defines as each level as well. And that has been really helpful in terms of making like, what does senior mean? In each organization, that's pretty different. And to actually have like tangible things to work towards. For instance, internally at my company, people always define like each level as just sort of generically broadening the scope of your involvement. But internally, what that means is outside of coding, one criteria, for instance, is that you should have expertise in something outside of coding. So one example is monitoring, understanding when like something goes down, how to like detect that, or having expertise in testing in one very specific domain knowledge area. And that's one measurement. There's other measurements internally of like things you need to meet in order to become senior. And then starting that conversation with your engineering manager of, hey, these are things that I'm working towards to get to this specific goal that I have in mind. And also internally, we have a tech lead and then an engineering manager where I go to them both for different things, where I'm like, hey, engineering manager, here's some career goals that I have in mind. Versus for my tech lead, my engineering manager will sort of funnel those career goals and convert them into work items sort of thing.
Sounds very similar to my day job. I'm one of those managers.
Yeah, that's awesome. Like, I would also love to hear more of your insight on how you keep your engineers' career goals in mind and how that converts into translating that to your tech leads and things like that.
So happily. The first thing I'd want to touch on is actually coming back to something you've just said, because it's so useful. So you talked about the need to look at the next level in your career, the next level within your company. What is one step up from you? What do you need to tick off if we're looking at it as a list? And a lot of companies, especially a lot of companies that really think about progression, may have some sort of career progression framework. Mm-hmm. If you're an engineer or if you're a technologist, if you're a designer, if you're essentially any technologist I can think of, and you're not in a career where they have very clearly spelled out levels, it's often really helpful to ask your manager, or I guess Google and look for the workable link, but look at the job description for what a mid-level version of your job is, or what a senior or what a lead version of your job is. Just looking at the job descriptions can give you a lot of insight on what kinds of things people are looking for.
But I also think that within the job descriptions, you need to look at like the gaps in between the job descriptions, because there are sometimes where there's room for biases per se, where unconscious biases.
Hopefully unconscious.
Right, hopefully unconscious. People will say things like, needs to interview, needs to interview, spend a certain amount of time interviewing. But if they don't show the engineers what does that interviewing path look like and how much is that certain amount of time, it seems somewhat arbitrary. So one of the things that we had noticed within our Women Eng group was we didn't have women interviewers, and they didn't know what the path was to become an interviewer. And then it was kind of almost universal that they were getting kind of dinged on their promotions because they hadn't interviewed, but no one had showed them what that path looks like. So sometimes there needs to be a connecting the dot moment for, especially, those who are excluded out of the conversation, to have a pathway and say, these are the exact dots and these are the connections between the dots that you need in order to move up in advancement.
And I think that's a terrific point, and something maybe managers and people running companies really need to keep in line. It's that I don't imagine not many of your employees are going to be psychic. When you say to get to the next level, you need to be hiring, you need to have experience with interviewing and working with candidates. If someone's never done that before, you need to supply the framework and the learning opportunities to really get them there. Otherwise, you're just going to be constantly chasing mid-level or senior talent back and forth across the hiring scene.
I agree.
Something along that I wanted to add is understanding what people assume to be industry knowledge. So one example that Gloria and I spoke about was in college, students are applying for internships, right? And people assume that it's common knowledge that you need to start applying in like August and September. But people don't realize that. And these students, they start applying in January, February, March. And then all of these large company internships, their applications close and these students are left for the summer with no job opportunities. And it's like, unless they're part of some larger online community, like on Facebook or something, that people just don't know that these are the timeframes that they need to apply.
I think that's really valuable as well. Like, not just knowing about the individual skills you need, but having the sort of insider track industry knowledge. Students or career changers might not know how early you need to apply for a specific program. They might not know what the interview styles are. And yeah, being able to have that knowledge is really, really fantastic and really, really difficult to get stuck into from the outside.
I also think that if a student doesn't have an internship, they think that their whole career is like over as a software engineer.
Oh, I know.
We need to,
darlings.
we need to instill in them the understanding that if you don't have an internship, work on a project or contribute to open source. All three of those are equally valuable from the aspect of, your next interview. They'll be able to see you are coding and you're contributing to, other people's codes, and then you've worked on something. You can kind of make your own makeshift internship if you need to.
Fantastic advice. So if you don't already have an internship and you're looking for next year, start researching now, maybe. Don't freak out. Just start. Sorry, I know it's a year ahead, but have a look. But if you don't have one this summer, it's cool. Be cool.
Okay.
Volunteer, volunteer for a nonprofit that needs some help, get involved with an open source project, or just build something weird and give it to the internet.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that your conversation on Twitter touched on offer letters quite a bit, and I was really interested in digging deeper into this.
Something I really wanted to talk about was specifically, and I still want to have these conversations with recruiter friends, which, by the way, they get so much shade on Twitter and things like that, but having recruiter friends is so helpful because specifically in the conversation was they know what levers they can pull on the business side of things in order to maximize your job offer. So Gloria, I think you can touch upon this, where something you suggested is if you're negotiating for a job offer, have them offer as much information as possible before you offer up any concrete numbers. So for instance, ask for what is your budget range that you can offer me?
Yeah. I was listening to one of the Her Money podcasts, and they were talking about negotiations. And that was the biggest takeaway that I had was she said, instead of waiting for someone to give you a number, you just ask, what's the range that you had budgeted for this position? And it gives you kind of like a starting point, per se, for that conversation to actually start. So you're not just kind of, shooting at the wind, giving an actual number. And, if you're kind of underestimating or that part, you kind of put the ball in their court to start the number conversation. And I really liked that aspect because you're not directly asking for a specific number, but you're saying, here's the range and, what are your expectations of job level for that range and how did you base that range? And then it gives you, the interviewees, some more leverage to kind of come out with a number of where you think you should be in the range of that aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. This is fantastic advice. And for folks based in the US, I'm probably wrong on this, but I believe that California and maybe New York are now required to supply a salary range for roles on request.
I believe so. And I also believe that they can't ask for your previous salary as well. So they can't base your income salary on what you previously were making.
So that's my favorite advice to folks is, especially for folks who are underrepresented in tech, who may be having a difficult time getting the salary they deserve, always try and politely dodge if someone asks you what you were on in your last role. Mm-hmm. I like to say, oh, well, I'm interviewing in the range of such and such, or I'd like to be comfortably in the range of X.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I heard someone say, companies are currently evaluating my skills at this range.
Oh, that's good.
That was a really interesting way of phrasing it.
Something else that I thought was interesting was negotiating actually your title. So recently, a friend of mine was talking about how her company they were like, oh, we don't negotiate base salary. And she was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Like, it seems fair. So everyone that's coming in has the same base salary. However, a peer that she had was in a similar job role. And then what he did was negotiated instead his title so that he was in a different pay bracket, which is something I didn't know that you could do. So she just took it face value. Okay, I'm in this job title. I'm going to take this base salary. But her peer was like, no, I need this salary range and you need to figure out how you're going to hit it. So the way that they did that was they instead bumped up his title level. So that was something really interesting that I thought was pretty insightful.
I'm a reasonably senior old lady, and I'm not terribly shy, but that still seems terrifically, beautifully bold.
Mm-hmm. It was definitely super interesting. And I assume like it depends on a case by case basis kind of thing, but it's definitely something you can put in your pocket if that's something that companies do. Gloria, when I was talking to her about this specific situation, she noted that, yeah, there's always a way to negotiate.
Yeah. And I think women particularly, and, underrepresented minorities need to be bold when they're negotiating pay, especially because of the equity gap. When you start to realize that we're not always going to be paid the same and you're almost always coming from behind anyways. And I feel like when you're negotiating, you're actually advocating for you to be equal the majority of the time. You're just advocating for you to be equal, and your skills. And when women and underrepresented minorities are already kind of the underdog in it or undervalued just by being themselves, I feel like they need to constantly advocate for themselves. And I'd much rather someone advocate too hard and shoot too high and land at equal than to not advocate for themselves and land very low. And sometimes I've seen people have $20,000 less on their paycheck than their comrade is. And that's close to $2,000 difference every month. And that can mean rent for people. It can mean, food. It's like very impactful. So I really try to advocate, especially for underrepresented minorities or anyone actually who never really had a mentor to navigate the space with, and they don't quite know what to expect. Shoot for the moon and over advocate, because the worst thing that can happen is they say no, And in Amy's story, her guy friend kept going back and say, I have to make this price point. I have to make this salary. And I feel like that intensity is something that's needed when you're negotiating any salary.
So I used to give the general advice that no one is ever going to rescind an offer if you ask for too much.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not quite true. Since giving that advice, I have had someone come back and say, oh, well, I asked for this range and they just said no and they stopped talking to me. So I'm going to update this advice for 2018, which is any place you'd probably want to work isn't going to completely shut you down for asking for too much.
I agree.
I meet so many people who are just so excited to be in the industry. They're career changers or they're new. And oftentimes they'll say, oh, well, I don't need that much or I don't expect that much. And one thing to remember is that a lot of times companies will value, teams will value, and your managers will value differently. They'll value your contributions based on how much they pay for it. I always say that putting yourself out there as the cheapest developer on the block is a little bit like advertising discount sushi.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I agree.
I love that ugh of remembering. Like, oh no.
I tell my son, my son just started to try sushi. And like we've lived in San Francisco and LA, very close to coast, but he wanted to try it when we were inland. And I was like, baby, you never get discount sushi. Like always go for good sushi. But I think that one thing to remember when you negotiate is like you're not just negotiating your salaries. If your company's that hard and stonewalling when you negotiate your salaries the first time, you're going to be negotiating a lot of different things when you are in an organization. You'll negotiate when you can take a vacation. You'll negotiate which feature you can try to get on. It's always going to be a constant conversation of you wanting something and the company wanting something and trying to figure out, how both needs can be met. It's usually a bad sign if someone is just that stone cold and just stops. It is, like you said, probably not somewhere you'd want to spend a lot of time at.
And I'm a really big fan of nudging people at data. So Glassdoor is not always fantastic. It's good a lot of the time. It's not always super solid, but it gives you a really good pay range for a lot of common companies. I really love pay scale data. They'll give you an idea of how much you should be making or could be making based on your demographic data, based on your education, based on your location, which if you're from Dublin and evaluating a job in San Francisco for the first time, it can be really, really nice to have what's the average salary for this?
Correct.
Another tool that I've seen is actually there's this companies that have H-1B employees. They are required to actually report their salary data. I forget what the website is called, but you can actually see like at your specific company, and it breaks it down by state as well and job title, what specific salary numbers H-1B employees are making.
And if you, dear listener, are based outside the US and you're not familiar with the term, H-1B is a common visa designation that's often applied to tech workers coming into the US. So this is all really fantastic advice. We've got a please do this, please do this, please do this. What would you like me or our dear listener to not do in negotiations?
Don't just negotiate salary.
Oh, what else can I negotiate for?
Oh, I mean, negotiate vacation time, negotiate your stock options, negotiate if you're relocation, negotiate your relocation, negotiate your days. Like if you're a mother like I am, I value having some stay-at-home days, like work from home days versus having to be at the office the whole time. So there's a lot of different aspects that you can negotiate. I also say negotiate conferences, especially if you're a woman in tech, negotiate them to pay your conferences.
So this might be a little bit of a skewed sample because I think all of us are going to go, yes. But getting either some visibility through speaking and outreach has been really fantastic for my career, or just being able to network through getting to events, getting to conferences can be really invaluable for your career.
Yes. And I really value the companies that allow their workers to go to these conferences or to contribute back to the open source society with some financial incentives, whether they're paying for it or covering their cost of meals or paying for the hotel stays. I have a girlfriend that works for LinkedIn, and she can present wherever she wants to present, but all of her slides at the end say, I think it says, I'm working at LinkedIn, and if you want to have opportunities at LinkedIn, we're constantly hiring, and she shows a link. And just having that opportunity allows her to have more of her speaking engagements covered, and they sponsor her a lot more when she talks. And so I think that's really important. But I also think that I was talking to Amy about this, that when we are, as women, we get invited to a lot of conferences that tend to be fields, and we don't have a lot of conferences that are very technical. And it's very important for us women to go to these technical conferences as well, so that we can advance our careers on a technical level and not be at a deficit to our counterparts.
That's really, really fantastic advice and some really valuable points on conferences. And you've listed a lot of really interesting things to negotiate for that maybe people new to the industry or maybe people who've been here a bit haven't heard of. I can negotiate my vacation. I can negotiate flex time. And things like relocation are really valuable. I was just thinking about what other things oftentimes people can get from employers that maybe someone hasn't heard of. I remember the first time I worked in a role that had a training budget or tuition assistance. I'm from education originally, so the idea that a company was just going to give me hundreds or thousands of dollars a year to learn was baffling. What else might be out there for people?
Well, for some people, you have the housing budget is something that is to be considerations. And this is everything that I always tell people to just consider. So if you're relocating, look for some place that's giving you like a housing allowance or a housing budget, or even has corporate housing, because that usually is like
corporate housing.
Yes. I know. Corporate housing. I know. Isn't that great? One of the perks of tech.
Yeah, I've heard of it being a thing in workplaces that friends had back in Japan, but I've never really thought of it as existing in the West.
Oh, yes. Especially in San Francisco, it's very competitive for housing. So it's not unheard of for people to have to leave instantaneously and go check out a house. And it's actually a very stressful process. So different organizations will have intern housing where this is where your interns are going to be staying for the next 6 weeks or however long the internships are.
Aren't you glad to be leaving the dorms? Welcome to your dorms.
Yes. Here's a dorm. We got food covered, dorms, everything. And I just look at what would be, my cost of starting a business. So some places will have all your food is covered. Some places have corporate housing covered. Sometimes you can negotiate the types of projects and who you're learning under, So there's definitely every aspect of the job, I guess, is something that you can negotiate.
And a lot of these things are much more common in the Bay. So, hey, if you come in, all your food's covered, or there's a gym membership, or we have a smoothie cart, or free beer. I'm not a free beer fan.
I'm not a free beer one either.
I mean, beer, yes, but like beer at work is often exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to speak upon actually the relocation budget. Something that people should watch out for is you need to ask when that money is coming in, especially for young people who are new grads or maybe interns. They're promised this large chunk of relocation fee, but then they don't ask when that's coming in. And oftentimes it comes in with your first paycheck, which you may or may not be in the financial position to wait that long. If you are renting, within San Francisco and you need that down payment or that first payment, you should probably make sure that that lines up with either your first paycheck, or you can ask to see if the company can make sure that money is sent to you earlier so that you're not in that financial bind. And it's something I don't think people are aware of.
I agree with Amy. Like, that's a negotiation that I always advocate that you should do it for day one. The day you show up, you should be able to get your relocation just because of the financial stress that it does put on people.
Well, it's something I've not been through a corporate relocation myself, and I would have never thought of. And I like to think I'm jaded and I've seen a lot, but hi, we're so happy to have you with the company. We're going to pay your relocation to get you here, but have fun for the first month or so. That seems a bit hard.
I think that companies do it from their standpoint of, we don't want to give someone an offer and send them the relocation fee and then have them not show up and then be out of that money, And so I can understand that. But I advocate for day one because you showed up, you're here, now give me the finances so that I can actually live. And I think it is more important for people who do not have that inbuilt network in that city where they're living, because I've had to host a lot of students on my couch until they got that relocation fee, because I was the only person they knew in the Bay that was near their job. And I think that when you don't have a sorority house or an uncle or anything like that established network, you're kind of going at it alone and you need something to advocate for you. So definitely advocating for day one relocation fee is important.
These are all really valuable tips. I'm being terribly greedy here. What else? What do I need to know?
Oh, sign-on bonuses.
Is that a thing? Well, I know it's a thing, but come on, for effect, that's a thing?
Yes. And I didn't know it was a thing until my girlfriend told me it was a thing. And I was like, what? I thought only like basketball players got sign-on bonuses. And then I realized,
I will add again that this is a your mileage may vary thing. I'm out here in Europe, and I think these are a lot less common. But if you are in the Bay, maybe if you're in New York and you're the hot new thing on the block, or the hot new thing out of the boot camp, or the hot new thing who's been around 20 years and wants to try something new. If you're in a high demand area, these exist.
Yes. It never hurts to ask, too.
Mm-hmm. I just find this conversation so interesting because these are things that I just always knew about. And I forget that people coming into the industry who don't necessarily have this terminology or vocabulary, it's not necessarily like a given fact that everyone knows. And I'm so glad they're having this conversation because I forget that this is not common knowledge. So on the topic of signing bonuses, I don't work at a large company, but from peers, I've heard numbers of, for instance, $50,000 USD.
What?
Yes.
Where do they work? And yeah.
And you know what? Actually, giving hard numbers is super useful. So I have peers who, this is a stock option. This is RSU number. So at Google, I've heard people give numbers of they have $200,000 plus worth of RSUs at Google with a 4-year, with a 4-year vesting period. But every year they also get a stock refresh. And then I've heard at Microsoft people getting $50,000 signing bonus, but these are for new grads. People who I've heard way larger numbers for people who have more years of experience. So I currently work at a startup, and if we are going to talk about terminology for startup, you may not necessarily get signing bonuses that are as large just because they don't have that kind of money on hand. But then the main thing that I want, and it's specifically because I can take on the risk right now because I'm younger, not to date myself, but the thing that I want is more stock options. I'm not super good with this kind of terminology, but stock options are different from RSUs in that you can't actually exchange your options for money yet because
future money.
Because it's future money. It's contingent on if your company gets acquired or if they go public. The thing that happens is I'm given a certain number of stock options, a strike price, and definitely make sure that you ask for what percentage of the company you're at.
Yeah.
And something else to keep note that I didn't actually know to ask for is asking, I forget what the terminology is called, but it's like the period of time that you can have to buy out your options once you leave the company. So depending on where you are at in your life, you may or may not want to join a company where it's, oh, you have like 30 days to buy out your options if you either get fired or leave. 30 days is pretty standard. 90 days is pretty standard as well. But you may want to, that's something to take into consideration as well. And usually they're not really negotiable because they're set by the board of directors of your startup. So that's just dropping some knowledge.
This is glorious. And if someone was going to get involved with stock options for the first time, it might be a good idea to find someone in industry who's done this before. Maybe politely say hi to Amy on Twitter, or look for folks in your network to be like, "Hi, stock options. How do those work?"
Yeah,
and your recruiter should be very helpful in discussing stock options and what the process is for that company, as far as like the dates and everything else like that. And usually, if they're giving you stock options or RSUs, it's not the first time that they've had that conversation. So you can just ask; they're open to it.
something else to take consideration. Again, I want to focus on the risk aspect. Again, these options, you again are not guaranteed to ever see the light of day for this money. And this is a risk that I'm willing to take on right now because at this stage in my life, I have no dependents, I have no spouse, I have no one that I need to take care of financially. And the only responsibility I have basically right now is taking care of my rent. And the options, if you exit, you can see large gains, but large risk as well, right? Where it's just like, if your company exits, it could be like 10x the return, that whatever number of options you have, for instance, whatever your strike price is. And so the way strike price works is that you need to have the money on hand to buy these options from your company, but your strike price is essentially the discounted price that you get as an employee of the company to buy out your options. And then the price that they sell it at is a different price. And the price that other people buy your options at is a different price if you go public, for instance.
During different parts of your career, you can take on different risks, and that will allow you to negotiate your different aspects. Like Amy said, she's willing to take on the risk of stocks, where for me, I have 2 kids and husbands. I'm not really focused on the stock part, but my actual take-home salary is very important to me. But also the type of job and where I can be in 5 years, I take that into consideration. So the type of work that I'm taking is also to consider when you're looking at multiple options, like who is your team, who you'll be working with, things of that nature. And even being able, especially if you're relocating, like to come out with a company or with your spouse to see that area is huge. And if I was someone with a family, I would not relocate unless they were willing to cover my spouse to come with me and check it out as well.
This is fantastic advice. We're going to have to wrap up in a second. Do each of you want to give me one more thing where you're like, hey, beautiful listener way out there in not radio land, podcast land. If you don't remember anything else, please remember this.
Always negotiate. You can negotiate everything, not just your salary. You can negotiate, your price for a bed, a table. Just constantly be practicing negotiating. My kids negotiate with me all the time. Like, it's just human nature to negotiate.
To
so
be like,
give me 5 more minutes, Mom.
You're like, I want 2 fun-sized chocolate bars if I can't have the full size.
Exactly. You must know my son. But yes, I think that, it never hurts to ask. Always be advocating for yourself constantly and always shoot high. If you have to come down, you can come down, but always shoot high. Never underestimate the value you bring to a company.
That's awesome advice. Let me think. Okay, so the piece of advice that I have is not necessarily advice per se, but like a mindset that I have. There's this article that came out from the New York Times that was titled, "I want to be rich and I'm not sorry." I have accepted that mindset as well, where it's just, one of my goals is to be rich. And let me explain. If I stayed at my current salary for the rest of my life, I would be more than set. So this isn't so much about the money, but about what money means in our society right now, in that it is the value that other people perceive you to have and the power that you have. And that's like money to me is a language that people use to measure your perceived value. And so that I think is important to me in terms of what I contribute back to my company. And I want to be compensated appropriately for that. I don't believe that people who make $500,000 at Google, for instance, all of them are like insanely smart. I think that it is done by playing your cards right, negotiating at every opportunity that you have, and just networking like crazy. Obviously, they have to be able to fulfill their roles, but I don't think it's fair to say that someone who makes $200,000 works any less harder than someone who makes $500,000. I want to learn how to operate in my role such that other people perceive that I bring that much value back to my company. That's just a mindset change that I've had recently. Like I want to make a lot of money and I'm not really ashamed of it.
And I think that goes to Amy to being like, I want to be wealthy. I want to be wealthy in knowledge. I want to be wealthy in career.
Absolutely.
I want to be wealthy in, finances. It's this whole wealth of health, wealth of travel, wealth of just being wealthy and whole rounded wealth,
I think that I secretly want to be wealthy in small fat dogs.
Yeah. Go for it.
Hugs everywhere.
Oh my gosh.
I wanted to thank you both so much for joining me. Just to recap, where can people find you online?
I am a very public person. So if you typed Gloria and Square into the internet, all my information will come up. So that's the easiest
I love
way.
that. You could just be like, Google me.
Yeah, Google me. You can find me. I will respond. But it's the benefit of having such a difficult last name. But in that case, you can also reach out to me on Twitter at Kimbwala, Kimbwala.
Fantastic. And Amy, where can we find you?
The traffic that I'm trying to drive on the internet is towards my YouTube channel right now. So if you just type in youtube.com/AmyCodes, AMYCODES. And then on Twitter, I am at the Amy Code. So that's singular for Twitter. You can also find me on the internet. If you probably type in Amy Codes, I'll be around.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you both again.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having us.
And thank you for joining us. If you come right back next Tuesday, we'll have a brand new episode where we're looking at how you can get paid to work in open source.